Hi, my name is Robert Shapiro. I wanted to talk a little more today about my ET contacts. I want to talk about one other time in particular. I was very young at that time, and I remember I had never really had any desire to go to camp. Go away and be someplace else. I always liked being at home, so I was kind of a homebody. But one year, when I was still very young, I had this urge, I can't explain it, this real desire to go to camp. And so I asked my folks, and they managed to squeeze together enough money to allow me to go off to camp. And so I went. I remember the camp was in northern Minnesota, and it had been built by German POWs during World War II. They just built it right in the middle of the forest, cut down the trees, and made like bunkhouses, and they did a good job. Anyway, so the camp was pretty good. It was supposed to last for a week, but I didn't go that long, and I'll tell you why. Keep in mind, with these ET contacts, I didn't remember the details until later, because this was happening in the 50s, and I think that people were insulated a bit from derision, because there was a lot of hassling that went with saying you had ET contacts then. So I think the deal was we just kind of forgot about it, or they had a way of helping us to forget about it. Anyway, the camp story again. So I remember being out there, and sure enough, the way kids are, I made a good friend with another young kid there, and I recall that he and I used to like to explore. Of course, they didn't want you to explore, they wanted you to be involved in the activities. But he and I used to be clambering around up on a hill. There was a hill right nearby, and was heavily forested, but if you were determined, you could climb up there. And he and I used to clamber around there a bit, and of course the counselors would shoo us away from there. But this is what I recall. I recall that after being there for 3 days, out of the blue, I suddenly wanted to go home. And I might add that my buddy there, the other kid, he had an accident and he went home. So he was only there for a couple of days. And after about 3 days, I just had this urgency to go home. So I called the folks, and they came and got me. And my dad was kind of mad because they had, kind of scrimped a bit to send me to camp. But he asked me why, and I just couldn't give him a logical answer. But I'm going to have that answer for you here right quick. Years later, I was living in Santa Fe, New Mexico with my then girlfriend, and we had gone to a movie. And I remember we came out of the movie. It was an unusual situation, Santa Fe being high desert, but once in a while there'd be fog. And I recall that on this occasion there was this low ground fog, not everywhere, just in places. So here we were, coming out of the movie, driving up the street in the general direction of our home, and there were 2 green lights. There wasn't a whole lot of lights in the town in those days, but there were these 2 green lights. But the fog, see, covered the poles the lights sat on. So really what I could see were these 2 green lights floating in the air. And bang, just like that, the whole experience at camp came back to me. I had totally forgotten it, as is typical to ET contactees. But it came back. And this is what I remembered. I remembered being up in this high valley. It was very open. There wasn't any trees in that area, but the grass was tall. Oh, the grass was up just below my knees. So that makes it, I don't know how tall it was. I was a youngster, maybe 10 years old, 11 or something like that. Anyway, the grass was pretty tall and it was wet. And it was nighttime. So there was a lot of dew there. It hadn't rained because there were just a few scattered clouds, but there was a bright moon, very bright. And I remember that my friend was with me. And we were standing in that field. And the field was entirely surrounded by pine trees. But over in a distance, over the pine trees, floats this thing that looked a lot like a football. But it was way too big to be one. And it floated over near to where we are, completely silent, not a sound. And it sort of settled, the way it looked like was hovered above the grass, but it's possible that it might have had legs that came down, and the grass just hid those legs. I don't know. But it was a ship. And I recall that the door slid open. I don't know how, but it was completely silent, and there was very bright light inside the ship. But the light didn't come out in such a way as it would illuminate the surrounding area. It just came out part way. Then there was this being who he had one hand where he grabbed the door, and he sort of leaned out. It reminded me of the picture of a conductor hanging out from the side of a railroad car and waving the lantern, only he didn't have a lantern, this guy, CT. But he was leaning out, and he waved like this. He had a big smile on his face. And that's really all I have, even to this date, remembered. The next thing I recalled was that Terry and I, oh, that was his name. I wasn't going to give his name because I don't know where he is. But I'm trying to protect him, but I don't even remember his last name, and maybe it'll be okay. Anyway, I remember that he was sitting down in the grass with his hands, his arms straight out behind him, and he was sitting, on the grass with his legs out in front of him. And I was standing there, and the ship was moving away, and very silently, just kind of gliding away over the top of the trees, and then it was gone. And that's all I remember about that, even now. But I do remember that the being that leaned out of the ship was smiling. It wasn't a Zeta being, but they weren't They weren't humans either. They were humanoids. They were just really special looking. So that's another one of my adventures. So apparently, within the next day or so, Terry had his accident and went home, and whatever compelled me to go to camp was over, and I just felt like I was done, and I wanted to go home. Funny old life, huh? Anyway, you'd think with my capacity to channel, I would have channeled these beings and found out all about it. But it's a funny thing. I haven't been motivated to do that. I've gotten a lot of information about Zeta Reticuli and the Zetas, and got a book out about that now and all that. And that was different, apparently. But this contact was unusual. Not that they're not all that way. I wanted to share it with you because it was just kind of an unusual thing, since I never had any great desire to go to camp, even though camp is an interesting place. One last thing. I'm going to bring this up even though it's not associated with my contact, because it's just interesting. While I was there at that camp, as I said, it was a German POW camp. And there was a couple of fellas that worked in the kitchen. and they were kind of adventurous too. And I remember that someone in the bunkhouse where I stayed during that camp peeked his head up into the attic space. There wasn't much attic space, but there was some. And they saw something back there. And these two fellas, being pretty adventurous, daredevil kind of guys, heard about it, and they came down and said, "We'll find out what it is." And they crawled up there in the attic, and they brought this thing down. And it was about, oh, maybe a foot and a half long, and it was a perfect model of the jet engines that were manufactured at Peenemünde and used during World War II for the Blitz in England. And I'll tell you, I remember that when we saw that, everybody got real serious. And I don't know whatever happened to that model, but the fellas that worked there, they took it to the head guy at the camp, and I can't tell you what happened to it. All I can say is the German POWs, at least one of them, if not more than one, must have worked at Peenemünde. I'll bet they managed to keep it secret. You know, life is strange, isn't it? Anyway, that's your bonus material. All I can say is I was attracted to go there. I met up with my new friend whom I didn't know before, named Terry. We had this amazing adventure, and that's about it. One last thing, since I'm giving you more than one last thing. I remember the day after we had the experience, and I think Terry had already gone home. I remember clambering up that hill. I remember waiting to do it when there was no consoles around, because I had the feeling that that valley, I still remembered a bit of it then, that valley was right over the top of that hill, and I managed to clamber all the way up to the top of it, and it was just more woods. So I don't know where that valley was with the trees around it, but I do know it was real. How about that? Good life.